Uh, I'd like to acknowledge first that we are on the lands of the Wabakal Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, for looking after the land. It's my pleasure to introduce Rod. Rod Noble has been a delegate to the Newcastle Trades Hall Council, which is now called Hunter Workers, for 46 years. He's been a representative of a number of different unions, including the Miscellaneous Workers Union, the Teachers Federation, and the National Tertiary Education Union. He served on the executive of the Newcastle Trades Hall Council for a number of years, representing the National Tertiary Education Union. He's currently a life member of the union. You have retired from there. Is that from the Trades Hall? Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I am a life member of the Trades Hall, the only one.
The only one, yes. Well, that shows you what great respect they have for you over there.
No, there's only.
There's only
the Constitution only allows one.
Right. Okay. All right. Okay. So they rejected my application. All right. Rod was born in Newcastle. His father was a railway worker. His grandfather was a coal miner who took part in the Great Rothbury Lockout of 1929-30, which I'm sure a lot of people would know about, and he may talk a little bit about that as well. Like many of his contemporaries in the 1960s, he left school to serve his time at the BHP. In his case, he was an apprentice electrician. He worked in his trade at the State Dockyard and on the railways. He then decided to take off and travel the world with some of his workmates, and then came back to Australia, where he settled down a little bit after. He has some great stories about his time overseas, but we won't go into that. He studied at night to gain entry to university. The university that he gained entry into was the University of New England, and in the early 1970s. All of that background led him to take a great interest in the work there for 20 years, teaching occupational health and safety, labour history, and industrial relations. Rod has been a long-time member of various political organisations, including being a founding member of the Armidale-based Social Action Movement from 1971 to 1976. He was a member of the ALP from 1975 to 1976. He was a member of the Communist Party of Australia from 1976 to 1990. And he was a founding member of the Progressive Labor Party from 1996 until now. And he's still very active in the Progressive Labor Party. He's published numerous booklets, articles, and papers on labour history, occupational health and safety, and workers' cultural themes. He's published a book in 2008 called Of Human Right and Human Gain, which is a history of the Hunters' Labour Movement. He's also undertaken research for a book which you may be familiar with, called Latent Quarry, Past and Present. And he's also co-authored the book Social Dimensions of Occupational Health and Safety. He's also been very prominent in the Newcastle People's Chorus, which is the Hunter Valley Union Social Justice Choir. And he's been an elected organiser of that particular organisation for 36 years. I have great pleasure in introducing my colleague and friend, Rod Noble, who will present history of the Newcastle Trades Hall Council, although I think that's maybe a little bit different to what I've been told. But anyway, labour history. Slightly different. Slightly different. Anyway, we will bear with that. My bad.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, folks, I'm sure everyone's heard of Tom Paine. If you haven't, you're going to know a bit about him fairly shortly, because he's got a strong relationship to to Newcastle. We might not believe that, but it's we're about to find out. But I want to start off with a song. Don't worry, I'm not going to try and sing. It's a tune from Grace Petrie, who's an English folk singer, and she sings a song called "The Bones of Tom Paine," and it tells its own story, and that's the place I want to start with about the development of the trade union movement in Newcastle.
Old Tom Paine is running down the road he went. He said, I can't stop now, child. King George is after me. He'd have a rope around my throat and hang me from the Liberty Tree. Well, I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. Well, I only spoke of freedom, justice for everyone. Ever since the very first word I spoke, I've been looking down the barrel of a gun. Well, they say I preach revolution. Let me say in my defense, all I ever did wherever I went was talk a lot of common sense. I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. Old Tom Paine, he ran so fast that he left me standing still. There I was, a piece of paper in my hand, standing at the top of the hill. It said, this is the age of reason, these are the rights of man. Kick off religion and monarchy, it was written in Tom Paine's plan. And I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. Old Tom Paine, there he lies. Nobody laughs and nobody cries, and where he goes and how he fares, nobody knows, nobody cares. So I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. I will dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance to Tom Paine's bones. Dance in the oldest boots I own to the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. To the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones. To the rhythm of Tom Paine's bones.
The words to that song, Grace Petrie didn't write it, but she's done probably the best version of it. That's because other folk singers in Britain have also sung it. But of course, The Age of Reason and The Rights of Man are the two of the most famous books that he wrote. He got himself into a hell of a lot of trouble because he was against the monarchy as well. Back in the late 1700s, that was probably not a very safe thing to do. And he ended up, he had to leave the UK. He was going to be hung or something like that, because what he was doing was against everything that people thought was normal back in those days. And he took off to America first, Tom Paine, and then he went and got involved in the Declaration of Independence, that the Americans had. Then he went to France and became the go-to person for the French Revolution. He was making himself sort of known all over the world for doing things. But he apart from not liking the monarchy, and that he was talking about changing the nature of society. This was, don't forget, the Dark Ages were over at this stage, and the Enlightenment that was underway. There were philosophers all over the place criticising that. Anyway, this brings us to a chap called Small Salts. That was actually his name. He was a convict. Small Salts, I think it was Joseph Small Salts, and poor old Joseph Small Salts, a very unusual name. So, anyway, he ended up just down the road here, down in 1806, the top of town, which was a coal mine that they were literally dragging coal out of the sides of little hillocks and that with their bare hands and sticks to dig it out with at that stage, 1806. And poor old Small Salts was talking to his fellow convicts during a working day down the road here, and he made the mistake of talking about Thomas Paine in a favourable manner, as he was charged with, and he was dragged out of the coal mine because he talking terrible things to his other convicts, and he was promptly given 100 lashes just for mentioning the name of Tom Paine. So that's what I'm going to talk about a bit is the various trends of people and events that set the groundwork. What I've termed creating an atmosphere for the development of unions, and he was the first chapter in that event because he was in there in the background talking about the need to change, and he certainly was became. Oh, that's Small Salts, of course. But he was followed fairly quickly, by the Great Reform Act of 1832, which talked about voting. At that stage, people didn't have a vote. That's what we've got to remind ourselves of. They didn't have a vote. And in 1832, they brought in the right to vote. Thomas Paine had been quite influential. And they didn't have the right to vote, but they brought the right to voting. But you had to own property. You had to be a male. You had to be a man, and you had to own property to get a vote back in those days. And it wasn't even everyone with property. It was only special people with property. So, but nevertheless, the Great Reform Act, as it was called, ironically, brought in a bit of the right to vote. And then comes Robert Owen. Robert Owen was he was famous for a lot of things, setting up cooperatives, and in the Lanark up in Scotland there, he had thousands of people living in cooperative movements way back. This is way back, and he actually ended up forming a Grand National Consolidated Trades Union. Very long name, but there's some longer ones coming out, unfortunately. But anyway, and that was in 1834. And that led directly to another direct experience to do with Newcastle, because the poor old Tolpuddle martyrs, of all places, in Tolpuddle, in Dorset, as they would say, in England, they decided to become associated with this Grand National Consolidated Trades Union. And the first one was, I'm trying to think of his name, it doesn't matter. Anyway, what was it? Anyway, it doesn't matter what his name was. One of the Dorset farm labourers was arrested, and another five of them altogether, there were 6 altogether, were arrested for having ultimately for having something to do with this Grand National unions that Robert Owen had got going. But it's right on the knocker, they arrested him for making an oath, swearing an oath, which was against the law, and they did not want the trade unions to be formed, and that was the point of it. And they arrested them and transported them to Australia. They were given, I don't know how many years, imprisonment, and 3 of them came here to the Hunter Valley. 3 of the Tolpuddle martyrs. What I'm getting around to is that wave after wave of influence amongst the common people was starting to happen, with waves of these people. And these people didn't, obviously, as Small Salts showed, these people didn't shut up. They talked about all these things going on back in England, and they came over, they brought the ideas with them, and they certainly started sharing those ideas. Now, the 3 Tolpuddle martyrs were up the valley, put up the valley to work for squatters, obviously, and as convicts. And you've got other waves of these people coming in. I mean, you can go into the Irish and the Scottish rebellious people that were starting to uprise, and they actually also were bringing all these ideas about a different way of doing things with them. Okay, so next you've got then the Chartist movement that was becoming even more influential. I'm sure some of you know about the Chartist movement, but it was again looking at the right to organise, the rights to vote, and at this stage, the rights to form combinations, because it was combinations were illegal at a point in time. So then that was up to 1848, and then we come to the lace workers of France, and you might ask, what on earth have they got to do with Newcastle? Well, you're about to find out, because back in the lace makers of France, they after the end of Napoleon, the British, the English at Waterloo, they won. They could do what they liked in France, to an extent, because they'd won the war, and because of the tariffs and that in Britain, in England, it was cheaper to produce lace and that in France. And a lot of the lace makers, and they were especially up in the mid north of England, Nottingham, for example, they were famous for the textile work and all the lace, and they smuggled. Even though it was illegal, because the technology, so all this technological stuff again is going on again today. The technology was the highest level of the technology back in those days. The British didn't want to share it with anything to do with France, so they banned the machines from going over there, a bit like chips, And but some smuggled some of the machines over there. These modern, top of the range, and then some of the local French people copied it, and before you knew it, there was about 3,000 English people over there working on these machines and making huge amounts of textiles, and particularly lace. And then things started to go upside down, because there was economic problems in the UK, Britain and England in particular, and that caused a lot of unemployment. And then of course there was another French Revolution in 1848. I'm sure people are aware that they were going on and off for a while, and everything started becoming very difficult for those thousands of English lace workers. But lace workers weren't, by the way, weren't female. Everyone's thinking, oh, there's a woman over there. They were male, but they weren't doing. They were the machine operators, the mechanics institute. Okay, that were in. They were the mechanics, and there was lots of them, and it was anyway. So that there was even carpenters, and there were all sorts of boilermakers even. But in those days, steam was coming in. So in 1848, they had to leave France and go. They wanted to go back to England, but they'd been away 15 more years at least from England, and the England decided to refuse them the right to be there, and because they were going to make the unemployment situation a lot worse. So they had a big meeting, and they said, we want to go to Australia. And so they said, okay, but you're not going to land in England, not even 1 foot are you going to sit down in England. So they brought them across the English Channel, and they pulled their boats up that they were coming across on beside the ships. There were 3 ships leaving for Australia. They didn't even let them off their boats onto the dry land. They put them straight onto those ships, and they sailed off to Australia. 3 shiploads over a period of 3 months. Well, there's a few more as well after that, but mostly. And they come into Port Jackson, of course, and Sydney, and and there was also problems there. They didn't want them all these people coming in taking their jobs, so they sent some of them off to Adelaide, some up to Parramatta, and about 120 of them up to Morpeth here in the Hunter Valley. So we've got about 120 of the French lace workers landed in Morpeth, and they were distributed around they were free settlers. They weren't convicts, right? They were free settlers, but they were spread around to work and got employment. They walked from the berths at Morpeth. They walked to East Maitland, where there was people set up to find them employment, and with all of the properties around the place, and they did. I mean, all those 120 weren't all working age. A lot of children involved as well. But that's the story of the very beginnings of the union movement, because these people, particularly those coming from France and the French Revolution, and they've been involved in that sort of stuff for a while, they came with a lot of pretty radical ideas, and they brought them with them. So you've got wave after wave of people, and the one thing that the English big mistake they made was Australia became the place to send everyone that was troublesome or uprising or getting involved in revolutions, and they just kept sending them here. And of course, Newcastle got its fair share. And there was no radios, no TV. They couldn't read, a lot of them. But what they did, they would tell the stories. That's how the words were got across. People would tell the stories about what had been going on, what their experiences were. And that brought poor old small salts to 100 lashes. But I suppose he would have kept on talking to all the convicts, but not when the guards were around anymore, that's for sure. So now the cultural stuff, well, we all know about the Mechanics Institutes, but there was brass bands. And in 1884, the 8-hour demonstration committee, which I'll talk a little bit about now because that's the basis of the whole current union movement here in the Hunter Valley. In their expenditure statements from 1884, they had money to have 3 bands play at their demonstration in 1884. One in Hamilton, one in Wallsend, and a Great Northern Band. And I don't know a huge amount about this, but those bands, but I'm assuming because of the Scottish English background, they would have been brass bands or a mixture of brass and pipe bands. I'm fairly sure, from what I know of other aspects of history, that that's probably been the case, that they would have been. And of course there were choirs like now, the Newcastle People's Chorus in Newcastle, but there were choirs way back then. And there were banners and the processions, the Stepfords, the Welsh tradition, of course, and so on. So that's a little bit about working class culture. And in those days, there were the beginnings of unions were the friendly societies, but they were mainly in existence for funeral benefits and when people got sick or injured or something to give them some money to survive, you know. Because the breadwinners then were sort of the only means of surviving, and there was a shorter hours movement, which was all quite middle class. It was sort of shopkeepers and so on. They were in favour of shorter hours for their own reasons, but then the 8-hour day was more to do with the craft unions, the beginnings of the craft unions. And because there was no 40-hour week back then. It was a 48-hour week, or actually more than that, because there were 10-hour days, and you had 6 of them. Was that 60-hour week? Sorry, yeah, that was 60-hour week, and gradually you can see a reason why the unions would have been formed to start with, and they gradually did get some leverage there, and then. One of the next things that happened, this is all about how the unions began to develop. We've got all these goings on, radical stuff all over the world, and all of those people coming to Australia and to Newcastle, bringing the ideas with them. And now the coal miners locally had, in 1860, had formed, they were just lodges in each particular separate mine to start with. They had a miners' lodge. They didn't have a big union. So they eventually all came together when the ventilation in the mines became an issue and people were getting sick. And you can imagine all the silica dust and all that sort of stuff, which they didn't know really much about the health effects of, but they knew how it affected them. Anyway, they formed the miners' union by joining a lot of those on that issue. They all met in a big paddock and come from all the lodges came, and they decided to form an overall union with all of the lodges together. And that was the beginning of peak unionism. And sorry, not big. That was the beginning of the big one big union of miners. A few years later, they actually formed a peak body, which was the 8-hour committee formed, and all the unions could be part of that. Yeah. Difference between craft and industrial unions. Craft unions was like carpenters, plasterers, stonemasons, boilermakers, and various crafts. They were generally conservative. There were reasons for that. The industrial unions, coal, steel, etc., they were more radical because they there were more of them to start with. Some of the craft unions were quite small. They had, some just had 30 members or 35 members locally here. At a time when the coal miners' union had 3,000 members locally, these smaller ones had 30 or 35 or 40 if you're really, lucky. So the militancy of the workforce grew once they were able to get that solidarity of people involved in the same sort of work together in large numbers. Again, the communications became a lot easier and a lot better. People were able to talk to each other and say, we've got to do something about this, we've got to do something about this. No TV, no radio. So that's how it began to get going. And the 8-hour movement was mainly to start with the craft and guilds and that. The internet connection's unstable. That's all right. And the 8-hour committee, as I mentioned, got going in 1869, first in Maitland, and because it was almost the same size as Newcastle then, Maitland was. In the 1860s, well, it was only then I think that Newcastle started to grow bigger, but anyway, Maitland was quite a, at least equal in numbers for a while. And the 8-hour committee then became the peak union body in the Hunter Valley until 1926. And in that year, the Newcastle Trades Hall Council was formed in 1926. It was an amalgamation of various factions that had developed during the First World War, when the conscription was brought in, and there was those in favour of conscription and those against it. And some unions became in favour of it and some became against it. And there were company unions formed because the trade union movement, generally speaking, was against conscription. But there were the companies that formed their own unions, and they became, they became like what they in those days would call scab unions. That is, they did the work that unionists were meant to be doing. And then at the end of the First World War, of course, there was the flu pandemic, and unions were very hard to organise because they would in the big halls, like at the 1919 that the new trades hall had been built in Union Street, quite large and big big meeting rooms, but the laws had you could only meet with no more than 3 people, and you had to be spaced apart, and things like that. So that was okay for company directors and so on, because they weren't democratic. But the ones that democratically required meetings to make decisions, it was very difficult, like for the unions to keep operating properly. And for quite a yeah, it's got some photos there. School of Arts in Wall's End, and that's the West Maitland one on the right there. Everyone started, reading became a very important thing to do. Again, no radio, no TV. And so you can see there that the one in Maitland was very very popular. That's the Wall's End one, very similar structure to this, if you noticed, yeah. The School of Arts and the Mechanics Institutes. Now, when I talked about the growth of militancy, and there were people don't want to talk about what happened in Newcastle in 1879 and 1888, but I'm sure some of you know what actually did happen here. We were under military occupation because of uprisings amongst the workers here. They sent in the entire New South Wales regiment in 1879 and again in 1888, not just for a few days. We're talking about 3 months. They were here with artillery, with machine guns, the Gatling guns and the Nordenfeldt guns. They were there to put down the workers, and that was don't hear about that these days. But it's very important to as part of our history. So the coal miners industry, being an industrial union and rather than a craft union, they had that direct approach to industrial relations, and they lived in close-knit communities. They shared common dangers, and it was more numerous than all of the other union organisations put together. And there's some stats there that I'll dig out because that meant, I already meant they could coordinate more easily and with common purpose. Okay, the military occupation, 1879 military occupation. I've got some figures here. So just get them out, and yeah, there we go. In 1879, there was 6,000 people. There was a strike, and there were scab unions, and sad to say, it was the Lambton coal mine just up the road here that actually wouldn't go along with all the other unions. They had a thing called a vend, and the vend was what was all of the coal mines, and agreed to by the miners' unions, would agree to a certain price for coal and payments and all that sort of stuff. But the Lambton mine owners refused to do that, and the workers there went along with them against the wishes of the miners everywhere else. So the miners, 1,600 miners and their families formed a mass picket and marched on Lambton to protest at the breakaways continuing to operate the pit, because they'd all gone out and strike for what their demands were, which were better pay and that sort of stuff. And at one point, those 6,000 miners, well, at that time, the population of Newcastle district was about 30,000 people. In present day terms, this march and picket of 6,000 miners would be the equivalent today of having 60,000 people marching on locally. And the reason they could do that, that's what it would be in today's proportionally to the population, is because they all lived together, worked together, and they were able to just be united together. And eventually, in September, the Lambton miners agreed to limit their production in order to ensure enough work for other pits. So they eventually gave in, but then the owners of the Lambton pit then locked out all of the Lambton mines, including the ones that had cooperated with them. No sort of gifts there, and they brought in the companies brought in non-union labour, scabs, let's call them what they were, from as far away as South Australia and Britain. It was not long after those scabs began to arrive that the military occupation started. The whole regiment come up with all their artillery and machine guns. And I think I do have some. There they are on the right's a Nordenfeldt, and and that you can just imagine. These weren't single shot things. The Gatling gun, I believe, rotated in the circle and fired as it went around. Just would have spread bullets everywhere. And the Nordenfeldt could do the same thing, but across that, like that. And of course they all had ordinary weapons and things like that too. So what the community used to do, and this comes back to the culture thing, the women would all come out with tin cans and kettles, and they would what's called tin kettles. The non-union labour, as they were coming out the street, they'd all come out and black, and that would also warn and draw all the other people in to sing songs to them, and I believe that the songs that they sang to them weren't very nice. And there were some problems that occurred, and a lot of people were put in court and charged with all sorts of things. But the local court in Maitland declared them because they got the local jury on the case, and they declared them innocent, and that they couldn't. Then the powers that be couldn't cope with that, so they sent all the trials. They transferred down to Sydney, so they could get them convicted and put into jail. Some of them were jailed for up to 2 years each. So, but anyway, the VEN system went back to being normal after all this. The army went back to Sydney. I mean, they'd been here 3 months or something like that at that stage, and I think they just had enough because no one supported them. They wouldn't even let them feed. They wouldn't sell them anything in the shops. They had to bring all their supplies in from outside. And eventually they went back, and the VEN system re-established itself. But then in 1888, what's that? 9 years later. The same thing happened again, and it was another huge one. And the I'll just get the quotes from the yep. Again, there was the miners' union officials that had 4,000 members of the union there, and there were 200 soldiers and a lot of police as well. So anyway, cutting long story short, the gathering, there was one of the big demonstrations they had also had 6,000 people. That would have been all of the families. They brought women, kids, a lot. They would come along and get stuck into the non-union labour. But at that stage, the district population was 56,000. 1888, and that in present day, that would be the equivalent of a gathering of well over 30,000 people on proportional population. You don't see groups of people protesting when you're getting sort of 50 to 30, 40 odd thousand people. It'd be a pretty very unusual. Well, I don't think it's ever happened, to be honest. But anyway, so those two military occupations were what's trying to be written out of history, but I've written it up wherever I can, and I mentioned it all over the place to remind people. Okay, so what's next? They were significant events, the 1879, 1888, but there's also the great strikes of the 1890s, the shearers' strikes, and there's ballads and songs been written about that. The price of wool was falling in 1891. The men who owned the acres said something must be done. There's a very famous ballad about that. And Peter Bowling strikes with the rise of the radical political movements, the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, and the anti-conscription actions, which I mentioned during the First World War, and then of course the Rothbury lockout in 1929, which my own grandfather was involved in. That was when the police opened fire, and there was quite a few of the miners were shot, and including one of them was shot dead, shot through the throat, and then others were shot in different places. But rather than go to the hospitals, they would go home to get fixed up with the wounds, because they were fearful of getting arrested once they got to hospital. And then of course even more recently the coal strike of 1949, and yeah, so that's there was quite a few significant events. And here's in 1921. This is out of one of the workers' weeklies. Will capitalism disarm? And I think the answer to that cartoon is no, they won't. By the looks of it, this was going on in the. This is the sort of workers were getting newspapers at this stage, and they were beginning to be able to read, so as opposed to talk to each other about things. Now, 1895, that's still in Hunter Street. If you ever walk down Hunter Street, that's the original Trades Hall. It was built in 1895, but by 1914 it was too small because there was being a big blossoming of unions then. The industrial legislation came in, and people were required to register as a union, to get arbitration. And in 1895, that one was built, and it became quickly too small, and a much bigger one was built in Union Street, just literally, a couple of 100 metres away. And so that's another photo. Oh, this is the sort of things that these appeared in the various union journals and newspapers. What we must expect. Now the Bruce government. Geez, I should know this. I think the Bruce government was 1930s. Who would know that?
I think you're right.
I think 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's certainly was the sort of thing. Take heed, the Crimes Act is aimed at you. And all right, yeah. Okay, so that's the first wave of big radicalisation was the Industrial Workers of the World and the One Big Union. It was 1907 to 1920, and then I mentioned the company unions. I mentioned the flu epidemic and how difficult that was to organise without. And the 8-hour committee that was formed in 1869, because trades and labour councils came and went, but the 8-hour committee was there all the time, and right from 1869 right through. And in fact, they dealt with not just the 8-hour day. It was the 8-hour day demonstration committee. They dealt with a lot of disputes between unions and against employers too. So they were the main body that kept it all together. And in that period, they finally, after years and years, big battle started in the 1860s for 8-hour days, and they finally got the 8-hour day, and down to a 44-hour week. So that meant the weekends started to be looking at a possibility for weekends instead of just the 1 day a week off. Annual leave, that was a really big radical step. And the unions were able to gain back. I think initially it was like 1 or 2 weeks, and since then, of course, it's gone up to 4 weeks. And safety legislation, which is very important. So the unions, in those periods when the unions were on their coming up, they were able to get all that legislation through. One thing to note is that the shearers' strikes in 1890, 91, the union membership at that point was was less than 10% of the workers. But the crucial thing was those 10% or less in some cases, all of the workers looked to them for leadership. And that's why those strikes were so successful, because, okay, you had you only had, 10% of the union of workers unionised, but those unionised workers were very, not only militant, but very well, able to get others organised. And that really had a big impact on the struggles over these sort of conditions, the 8-hour day and 44-hour week and the annual leave. But certainly by the about 10 years or 15 years after the big shearers strikes, the unions just went gangbusters. There was people joining unions everywhere, and certainly with the Arbitration Act coming in, that helped people would form unions wherever they could because there was big advantages in it. There's the second trades hall that I mentioned. The picture on the right, if you looked at the Workers' Club back in the 1970s, you would it was built around that. You would recognise bits of the 1970s Workers' Club with some of these structures. It was built around it. Of course, it was all destroyed in the earthquake in 1989. And but that's pictures of the new trades fair, and inside that was also a little workers' club from the 1840s on, and there was a workers' education organisation was set up in there as well, doing they called it a labour college. It was called, yeah. And the third wave of radicalisation was 1920 onwards, and that partly came in with the leadership. Well, there was a kind of left-wing leadership in the 1930s. It was a mixture of ALP and CPA, but then the CPA became dominant in 1940s onwards till about 1990. And those achievements over that period, and that second period of radicalisation, was the 40-hour week, big improvements, 4 weeks annual leave, work health safety, dirt money was eliminated. I remember when I was in the steelworks in the 1960s, that's how old I am. In the 1960s, I remember we used to get dirt money, and if we worked in something where we shouldn't have been working because it was so bad in the conditions, but the incentive was, oh well, you'll get dirt money, and dirt money was eliminated eventually, and the Newcastle Trades Hall Council was formed in 1926, and uniting all the factions that fought out during the First World War over the conscription issues and all that. Eventually, there was 2 different trades and labour councils. They finally got into one body called the Newcastle Trades Hall Council, and there was a long name after that. I told you there was one more long name. Newcastle Trades Hall Council and 8-hour day demonstration committee. That was what its legal title was. And even today, with the Newcastle Trades Hall Council and the Hunter Workers, the Newcastle Trades Hall Council is still, it's the registered, legally registered name of Newcastle, but its trading name, for want of a better word, is Hunter Workers now. That change was brought in 2014, 15, around about that period, from my recollection. Currently, that all those things have been won by collective action and by within the union movement. And Newcastle has got its reputation around the whole of Australia as being the militant centre of Australia. And when you look back on those sorts of things, that you see where that name was obtained from. I think that's probably, that's it. That's
I have a question, right?
Question, yeah.
When there was military occupation of Newcastle, did they declare martial law? How did that kind of operate?
Well, I think they would have liked to, but there was other work going on. It was the miners they were honing in on because, and they ended up like they're not just against the miners themselves, they were against the whole community.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah, that was that, because the miners were like I mentioned, they were 10 times bigger than all the other unions put together, you know, in the sense of membership.
So when you say military occupation, is it just a question of trying to keep the mines open with
scab
labour?
yeah, with scab labour.
Okay.
Yeah, but they would have to go along with the non-union labourers trying to get to work
Okay.
all the time. I think they just got absolutely over it. You know, that was because everyone was just yelling at them and well, that's all the time. So I think they probably couldn't get back to Sydney fast enough.
What was the impetus for Trades Hall building in Hunter Street, and who kind of organised that? Was that the 8-hour committee?
That was the 8-hour committee, because at that stage there was not a Trades and Labour Council still. That was the 8-hour committee was the main body, and they formed the management committee of the Workers' Club, of the old one and the new one. They became the management committee. And in fact, when the scab unions that I mentioned in the First World War, when they were trying to organise, the 8-hour committee banned them from the Trades Hall. They wouldn't allow them to meet there. But I mean, all of the unions have been meeting in pubs anyway until they got that first Trades Hall that I showed you a photo of. It's in Hunter Street. From prior to that, all of the meetings were in pubs, and which had its dangers in cultural. Let's put it cultural problems. But once they had a Trades Hall to meet in, it was a lot better then. It's been there ever since. But if you walk down King Street, you'll see 408, 410 or something King Street. It's now called the Hunter Workers Union Building, and it's quite large. You'll see it there, opposite the City West Club. It's just directly across the road from that. That's where the new Hunter Workers Building is.
And they still have a collection of banners in that building?
Oh yes. Yep. The cultural side of the union movement is massive. I mean, it's not just bands and banners, but it's not just bands, it's banners and lots of songs. I wanted to put one more song on, which is a very recent song.
There is power in the factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. There is power in a union. Now the lessons of the past were all learned with workers' blood. Mistakes of the bosses we must pay for. From the cities and the farmlands to trenches full of mud. War's always been the boss's way, sir. The union forever defending our rights. Down with the black leg, the workers unite. With our brothers and our sisters in many far-off lands. There is power in our union.
Thank you so much, Rod, for such an interesting presentation on the history of Newcastle Trades Hall. I certainly learnt a great deal tonight, and I'm sure our members and guests now have a much greater understanding of this important part of our Newcastle history. Thank you, Rod.